Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining the Gallipoli Association talk tonight. My name is Stephen Chambers. I'm a trustee and historian of the Gallipoli Association, and my talk tonight will be on the Royal Naval Armoured Car Division at Gallipoli. I suppose one of the first questions is why the Royal Naval Armoured Car Division? It is rather an unusual unit, and it has interested me for many years. It probably began 20 years ago when there was a local auction lot of some letters, photographs and medals belonging to a sub-lieutenant Douglas Illingworth, who I found out later was a member of number 3 Squadron, Royal Naval Armoured Car Division, and we'll hear a little bit more about him later. The division is really interesting to study. It was led by many well-to-do officers, quite a few of them members of Parliament. We've got sons of lords, dukes, pioneering aviators, Antarctic explorers, and even a Wimbledon tennis champion thrown in. And with them, they selected the best of their class at the time of drivers, mechanics, and machine gunners to go to war in 1914. It is no wonder then that the thoroughbred of cars from Mr. Rolls and Mr. Royce was their chosen vehicle. As you can see silhouetted in the unit's bronze badge, there is something about the Rolls-Royce, its name, and the period that brings visions of style, quality, empire, sort of best of breed that served in far-flung outposts and battlefields. T. Lawrence, aka Lawrence of Arabia, famously valued Rolls-Royce armour cars so highly that during the Arab Revolt, he wrote, "A Rolls in the desert is above rubies." He praised their reliability, their speed and cross-country performance, noting their critical role in his mobile desert campaigns against the Ottoman forces. But the desert was not the terrain they would encounter at Gallipoli. It's not unusual, as Tom Jones would probably say. The Naval Armoured Car Division was anything but unusual, but it was not alone. As you can see from the few units there, you had some very interesting units that joined the British Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. You've got the Zion Mule Corps, made up of Jewish volunteers, primarily from the Russian Empire, who had been living in Egypt prior to the war. You've got the Ceylon Planters Rifle Corps, a volunteer force from Ceylon, which is now Sri Lanka. The Rifles sent a contingent of 237 out to Gallipoli, who at Anzac notably served as the personal bodyguard and security force for none other than General Sir William Birdwood. And we also have other units like the Burma Military Police, the Royal Australian Naval Bridging Train, and of course the Royal Naval Armoured Car Division. Now, there's nothing new with chariots of war. This war chariot, you can see on the left-hand side, dates from around 3,000 years ago, and in its own right is an early armour car or armour carriage. It had a crew of 3. It had a driver, a shield bearer, and an armoured spearman, not dissimilar in a way to a 1915 Rolls-Royce armour car, which would have a commander, a driver, and a gunner. On the right-hand side is one of my favourite westerns, sadly, the War Wagon. You can see sort of down the bottom there, this armoured stagecoach pulled by, hard to tell, there's it 2, 4 or 6 horses, or even 8 horses. In comparison to the Rolls-Royce, that would have a whole 50 horses under its bonnet. When the Honourable Charles Rolls and Henry Royce met at the Grand Central Hotel in Manchester in 1906, a legendary marque was born. Within a year, the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost was in full production, which was praised at the time and named the best car in the world. It was the Silver Ghost chassis that the 1914 model Rolls-Royce armoured car was based. Weighing around 4 tons, it was powered by a 6-cylinder dual ignition engine, which had a capacity of just over 7 litres, and that could reach speeds of around 50 miles an hour on a good road. However, its fuel consumption was rather atrocious at 8 miles per gallon. The armoured car was crewed, as mentioned already, by 3. The armament was more often than not a 303 Maxim or Vickers machine gun, and these were mounted typically in a revolving turret although sometimes on the rear seat of a car. And I can just show you a photograph of one, and you can see the two different styles there. On the left-hand side is a Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost sort of touring edition with 6mm armour, and you can see a Vickers machine gun there on the rear seat. And these went to war late in 1914 over to France and Belgium. And on the right-hand side, we'll talk a little bit more about it later, is what became the Royal Naval Air Service pattern of the Rolls-Royce Armoured Car, which you can see there with slightly heavier armour and also with a turret, so covered completely to protect the gunner, the driver and the commander as well. It is interesting to note that in the run-up to the Great War in August 1914, neither the British Army or the Royal Navy or anywhere else in the British Empire possessed any armoured cars. A few attempts before the war had been made by inventors and companies that included famous names like Vickers and Armstrong, but the military were not really that interested. The situation was similar throughout the European continent. However, Italy and France did show a little bit more interest than some other countries. In Italy, they used a Fiat, which was fairly lightly armoured, and that actually went into operation in the war against the Ottomans in Libya in between 1911 and 1912. And you could argue it was the first tactical use of armoured cars in warfare. France as well, they also used a CGV Charon model, which they used in French Morocco and Algeria, mainly for internal security work. And some of those they actually sold to the Imperial Russian Empire as well. And they were used within the cities within Russia, but based on that French model car. With the outbreak of war in 1914, there appears to have been fears in the UK of invasion. And it's interesting how that sort of resulted in the development of armoured cars, or the very early development of armoured cars in 1914. There are three sort of main risks, I suppose, at that time. Was one, risk from invasion, which required a requirement for home defence and fast-moving reactive forces. So an armoured car would be ideal for that. There's also the risk from air attack from both Zeppelins and aeroplanes, and that drove this requirement for air defence. And I suppose thirdly, the threat from U-boats as well in the English Channel, which also drove a requirement for aerial reconnaissance at sea from the fledgling Royal Flying Corps and also Royal Naval Air Service at the time. At the time, the staff of the Royal Navy Flying School, which came under Commander Charles Sampson, who was based in Eastchurch in Kent, appears to have been thinking of similar risks to the UK, although there's no real realistic threat assessment to guide their thinking and efforts. Sampson had been at Eastchurch since around 1912 and had a good set of motivated officers and men to work with. He also had around 20 enlisted transport drivers who Sampson states were really the most skilled motor mechanics he had chosen from manufacturers like Rolls-Royce, like Wolseley, and also the Talbot Motor Companies in the UK. However, the biggest fear at Eastchurch was probably missing out on the action and not being part of the war effort. With friends in high places like Winston Churchill, Sampson didn't really need to worry. In the late summer of 1914, with too few aircraft at his disposal, Sampson found himself patrolling the French and Belgian countryside in privately owned cars that some of his officers had actually taken to war with them. Sampson's aeroplane exploits around Ypres and Courtrai, and also his fledgling armoured cars, were soon making a name for himself, to the extent that Sampson soon had a price on his head of a whole £1,000. The Germans nicknamed him Captain Kettle. I'm not 100% sure why, but an interesting sort of takeaway from the article and that photograph on the right-hand side, which shows him in his Royal Naval Air Service uniform. On the left-hand side, he's wearing his khaki drill, which was the time he went out to the Dardanelles. He's probably on one of the islands there a little bit later on in the campaign. One of those desperate to join Sampson's Eastchurch squadron was the Honourable Arthur George Cook. He was the second son of the Earl of Leicester. At the outbreak of the war, Cook was commissioned to the Royal Horse Guards and had already seen some action in Flanders and during the First Battle of Ypres. Well, the winter of 1914, Cook was looking for his next adventure and wrote in the letter, "What I'm really very anxious to do is to get into Commander Sampson's armoured cars. They get a lot of exciting fighting, which is better than sitting in these infernal trenches." He eventually got his wish in January 1915 when he got commissioned into the Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve as an officer in the Royal Naval Armoured Car Division. And we'll hear a little bit more about him later on. Sampson took his fledgling force out, and very early on he realised he needed to mark the cars. So you can see on that top image, that top drawing, the big RN for Royal Navy, and you've got the Union flag there, and also the white ensign, which they flew quite a lot. And the good reason for that was, in the early stages of the war, it wasn't unknown for aircraft to be shot at by their own forces. They were so new and so different that it wasn't just the Germans shooting at the British aircraft, but also their own side. And the same happened to the cars as well in those initial sorties out into the countryside. The soldiers there and the Marines supporting the Belgian and French forces weren't aware the cars were there, and they often attracted quite a lot of friendly fire. Whilst the squadron's air element was there for aerial reconnaissance, looking for the German army and for U-boats, of course, in the Channel, the cars were primarily used for ground reconnaissance. It didn't take long before this boy's own mindset set into Sampson's men, and you hear words like Ulan baiting. Ulans was a colloquial term at the time for German cavalry, and sort of covers any sort of German cavalrymen on horseback, although not strictly true. Yeah, quite an interesting stories around 1914, which is a little bit outside of scope for this talk. And here we have the Admiralty pattern, turreted for November 1914. Originally operating under their own initiative, the cars Sampson developed were originally called the RNAS pattern, the Royal Naval Air Service pattern. And upon receiving support from the Admiralty, particularly Winston Churchill, who was First Lord of the Admiralty at the time, they became known as the Admiralty pattern. Those developed went through several stages that began in the very early part, or the late part of 1914, by adding 6mm boilerplate to the vehicles, to the Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost touring version. What they found for the boilerplate was it was very vulnerable to bullets at a range, or any range, under 500 yards. So they swapped this out for much thicker armour and also overhead protection, as you can see in the drawing with the turret on top. They ended up choosing a 8mm thick nickel chrome steel, which was enough to stop sort of small arms bullets, to provide enough protection for the crew. And they were armed with, as you can see in this photograph, a Vickers 303, or typically a naval Maxim gun, which was slightly heavier, or even the Lewis guns as well, which British were buying from the Belgians at the time. There were 89 actually turreted Rolls-Royces eventually built, and these were divided into 7 squadrons, which we'll hear about a little bit later. Evolving from the work of Sampson, the Naval Armoured Car Division was actually officially formed in November 1914. It was based in Wormwood Scrubs, using the Daily Mail's airship sheds, and they're also based down at the Talbot Motor Works, which was just down the road from Wormwood Scrubs in Notting Hill. Its HQ was in 48 Dover Street near Piccadilly, and they all came under the command of Lieutenant Commander James Boothby, a former Scots Guardsman. The site was soon renamed RNAS Wormwood Scrubs, and today that's situated sort of east of Acton, if you know London, sort of north of White City, and left of Ladbroke Grove on the western side of London. The actual site itself was closed in 1919, but interestingly, it was still retained well into the 1930s as an emergency landing site for any aircraft in the London area. And today you can probably just see this stadium underneath the Wormwood Scrubs car park. And for those who know London, that's the Linford Christie Athletic Stadium. As you can see the open ground there where they had the airship sheds, and the airship example there on the right-hand side. Training, really, really important, and there was a lot of training that went on at Wormwood Scrubs. The men were required to set a rigorous mechanical competence and medical examination. Those who passed were rewarded well with high rates of pay, and they were given the rank of petty officer or petty officer mechanic. The army, in a way, was a little bit less cited, and those who were mechanically competent were only given the rank of private, and of course with a private's pay. So the Royal Naval Air Service attracted a lot of those who were mechanically minded to join the Armoured Car Division. One of those volunteers was Petty Officer Mechanic David Fife, who wrote, "In view of our purpose in life, which is to act as motor car cavalry for reconnaissance and advanced skirmishing work, our training has been nothing if not comprehensive. Besides the general motor car and motorcycle instruction, with the nature of our work demands, we have also spent endless time and trouble in becoming thoroughly conversant with the internal economy of the Maxim gun, which forms the armament of our oars." I love that. The Maxim are their oars. The original Eastchurch Squadron from Kent consisted of number 1, 2, 3, and 4 squadrons, but they quickly went on to expand by the end of 1914 to 20 squadrons in total. Each squadron had a slightly different configuration. Some were just armour cars, some were a mix of armour cars and lorries with artillery, others were just machine guns on motorcycles. And like this photograph, it's not uncommon to see them driving around the UK, around London, Norfolk, Suffolk, flying their Royal Naval white ensign there, as you can see from the top of the turret. It was also certainly a strange composition of men and machines, which led to their very existence being questioned. The division was actually reviewed by Commodore Cecil Lambert, who was 4th Sea Lord at the time, and he was very sceptical of what he called armour car and caterpillar nonsense. Nonsense or not, some of the squadrons were already being used for home defence, while others were being prepped to go overseas. As you can see there on the right-hand side, number 3 and number 4 squadrons, number 3 under Commander Wedgwood, Josiah Wedgwood MP, and James Boothby's one, number 4, were the first 2 selected to go out to the Dardanelles, to go out to Gallipoli, and they were fully armour cars, 12 armour cars each. The last 4 were actually what they styled as motor Maxim squadrons, which were motorcycles with sidecars or motorcycles without sidecars with machine guns as well. So you had 6 squadrons in total going out to Gallipoli. Number 1 squadron at the very top there went out to Southwest Africa, to Namibia, as it is today. Number 2 under the Duke of Westminster went out to France. And you can see 5, 6, and 8 squadrons also went out to France, while number 7 was retained for home defence. And this only shows you the first 12 squadrons of those 20. It's interesting to note Samson sort of comes away from the Naval Armoured Car Division at this time. However, he reverts back to command in the air component of the Royal Naval Air Service. Ironically, number 3 squadron, which later became number 3 wing in the Dardanelles. The journey to the Dardanelles would take the men from London via Norfolk to Devon, where they boarded their transports in Plymouth in March 1915. Petty Officer David Fife from 3 Squadron wrote, "At last, it seems we're going to get to business very soon, for today we have just been inspected by Commander Boothby, who told us at the conclusion of inspection that we're all going to sail for the Mediterranean on Saturday first. What this exactly means, nobody knows. It looks like participation in a projected expedition against Constantinople, but as the roads there are, by all reports, conspicuous by their absence, many people think we are bound for Egypt for canal patrol work with our oars," meaning the Maxims. "And this is a job that everyone is most anxious to avoid, the universal view in the squadron being active service at all costs." And just want to point out the picture there. You can just see on the screen on the left-hand side, the armour car with a fox mascot at the very top of the turret. We'll come back to that later because that features in quite a few photographs of the cars that went out to Gallipoli. Now, number 3 squadron, as mentioned, was commanded by Lieutenant Commander Josiah Wedgwood MP. It's Wedgwood from the distinguished Staffordshire pottery firm, who was also very good friends with Winston Churchill. I believe he was a Liberal MP to begin with, and possibly a Labour MP, I think, later on, just after the war. And he was sort of paramount in getting the squadron's active service. He was supported by his second in command, Lieutenant Francis McLaren, also an MP, a Liberal MP, and he had really good connections as well. He often played bridge in Downing Street with the Prime Minister, and also Herbert Asquith's son Anthony and their daughter Violet had, funny enough, been the page and bridesmaid for McLaren's wedding earlier in 1911. So they mixed in really good circles. Churchill, Asquith, all very influential people to get the squadron going where they wanted to go, i.e. active service at all costs. However, both Wedgwood and McLaren kept on canvassing to get their squadrons moved from home service to overseas service, and they were quite happy when they became part of Sir Ian Hamilton's Mediterranean Expeditionary Force in March 1915. With fantasy thoughts, one idea McLaren heard was they might be sent through the Dardanelles to land at Constantinople to, quote, roll up to Vienna. Out of frustration, McLaren confronted Sir Ian Hamilton, who promised to help all he could. But then he pointed out, of course, quote, what is obvious to everyone and makes us rather a laughingstock, that for the Gallipoli campaign, armoured cars are absolutely absurd. Conditions are so rough that they cannot be used as cavalry or any form of wheeled transport. What then is our fate? McLaren asked. I still believe in armoured cars and think if Gallipoli is taken, Constantinople falls, Romania and Bulgaria come in, we should have a great opportunity, but that is a far cry, and I do not mean to stay in the bay doing nothing and perhaps returning to England without a shot being fired. McLaren boiled it down to 2 points. One, they could land at Gallipoli on their feet and use the machine guns to help the army. Funny enough, that is what happened for the early part. Or two, they needed to find another job. Whilst it looked like they were unlikely to be needed ashore at the very early part of the landings, or for at least a month, or at worst, they may have to return to England or sent to Egypt, Wedgwood himself decided to, cry out for one last appeal to Sir Ian Hamilton. Accompanied by Arthur Cook, he went to see Hamilton one evening on the 18th of April, is noted in the diary, to offer their services, quote, in any capacity. Cook later wrote of this meeting to his wife the following day, and he said, the General said he wanted some Marines to man the first troop ship that lands. Isn't that splendid? We shall have that job. Wedgwood, Illingworth, Parker and myself. 40 men will take 10 Maxims, putting them all round the forecastle of the ship, and we are to cover the landing of the first troops, who are 2,000 Irish Fusiliers, regulars. Captain Unwin of the Navy is in charge, and he only has 12 men. He is going to beach her and cut holes under the forecastle for the men to immediately jump out and land. I cannot think of anything more exciting. Also, we shall see the whole thing. We shall have the fleet behind us, so if the Turks do shell us, I don't think it will be for long, although she is a pretty big target. Today we have been very busy building shelters for our guns, and I believe we start the landing this week. I think it will be a short but sharp to take Gallipoli. How wrong was he? So leaving McLaren, the drivers and the best mechanics on board the transports with the armoured cars, the 4 selected officers took 40 men and 10 machine guns. In a very enthusiastic letter written a few days before the landing to his mother, Wedgwood wrote, quote, It is just exactly the job I should have liked to get. The captain is going to run the ship ashore so the troops can disembark, dry shod, and our guns mounted on the ship will cover the landing. The captain calls this ship the wooden horse of Troy, for it looks like a collier gone wrong, and from it will spring in thousands armed men, armed to the teeth. Now, the SS River Clyde needs no introduction, or the V Beach landing. If you want to know more about that, I'd thoroughly recommend Stephen Snelling's book, The Wooden Horse of Gallipoli. But in brief, one of the landings designated for Cape Helles on the south of Gallipoli, which was going to be spear pointed by the 29th Division, was V Beach. The converted steam collier, named the River Clyde, and the command of Captain Edward Unwin, Royal Navy, was converted into this Trojan horse. It was filled with roughly 2,000 men, a mix of Munster Fusiliers, Hampshire Regiment, and Dublin Fusiliers landing in boats. As already mentioned by Wedgwood, there were no armoured cars on the ship at the time, but they did take 10 machine guns, 12 Scott model motorcycles in order to transfer their guns ashore later, and enough ammunition to last them the first week ashore. And this detachment from number 3 squadron were to man those guns. As you can see from this drawing, which is one of Cook's drawings, you can see how the guns, all 10 in total, are actually positioned. At the very top of the page, on the forecastle, you can see where Cook had his 3 Maxim guns there, one at the very end, one to the right on the starboard and one on the port side. Parker and the other officers on the port side had 3 starboards, so had three Maxim guns. Also on the port side, Wedgwood had 1 gun up on the bridge, and Douglas Illingworth had 3 guns at the very bottom of the ship. You can see in this photograph, these are the armoured casemates. You can see one, I'm circling there, the front of the picture, and there's one a little bit further back. These are Parker's ones on the starboard side. There will be a third one a little bit further on towards the bottom of the picture we can't quite see. And there you see one of Cook's casements just behind. Interesting graffiti there. It looks like matinee something, and I can't quite make it out. And you can see David Fife, which is the petty officer there, just looking down. And to the left, the officer there is Arthur George Cook, we'll hear a little bit more about later. And this is a fantastic photograph there of the bow of the River Clyde. You can see Cook's positions, like one casemate there in the, casement in the middle there, and to the left are the other 2 where he had his machine gunners. And it was Cook who actually said in one of his letters, he said, quote, "This will be my seat in the stalls, and many a man in England would give £1,000 for it." And you can see this sort of artist impression there on the bow of the River Clyde. You can see the casements, the 3 there at the very front, and you can see the bridge of boats to connect the River Clyde to the shore. When he's talking about his seat in the stalls, he's using a theatre analogy there, meaning the seat located at the front closest to the stage, if you wondered what that meant. So the landing itself, very famous picture there of the mix of mainly Dublin Fusiliers, probably ashore there, and some Munsters, and you can see the barges have been split. You can see the mass of men there, like ants, taking cover by the sandbank along the beach at V Beach, and you've got more soldiers there ashore, barbed wire in front, and no one getting anywhere near the Turkish positions in Saddlebayer fort or village, or any of their trench systems. The V Beach landing was pretty much a disaster. However, it was the guns of the Royal Naval Armoured Car Division which probably saved it from disaster to something worse than that. And Illingworth has a great account of that, and I just want to read what he said in one of his letters about the landing. Quote, he said, "The Turks had no guns to speak of, And what they had were very bad range on bad shells, for not a single shell burst which hit the ship. We ran ashore all right, but the barges we towed alongside did everything but what we intended. Of course, no sane man would ever expect otherwise. But what was not the real trouble, our naval guns, sorry, but that was not the real trouble. Our naval guns did not cover the landing well, so we lost heavily while the men were going from our wreck to the shore. Battleships as artillery are a failure. They are difficult to communicate with and not familiar with land operations. The hillsides leading up from the little bay were covered with trenches and comparatively little damaged. So this, as I say, is a real action photograph. And it was actually through the bravery of Captain Unwin and several others that actually saved this landing from complete disaster. Unwin, Captain Unwin from the Royal Navy, asked for several volunteers, and something you don't necessarily read in a lot of the accounts is quite a few of those volunteers were actually from Wedgwood's Royal Naval Armoured Car Division. For example, Petty Officer John Russell, who dived into the water with Captain Unwin. He was almost immediately shot in the stomach, but he still helped Unwin load the wounded onto the boat to try to get them back to the safety of the River Clyde. Other Naval Armoured Car Division troops included Sub-Lieutenant Parks, Chief Petty Officer Little, Petty Officer Bartons, Taylor Murray, and Petty Officer Mechanic Geoffrey Rumming. All of those helped wounded under fire. As you probably know, those more familiar with the V Beach landing, there were 6 Naval Victoria Crosses awarded for the landings. Josiah Wedgwood, the commander, recommended both Russell and Rumming for the VC, the Victoria Cross, for their deeds, but instead they were awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal. Wedgwood would actually get the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, for recognition for his brave work that day on V Beach. It's actually said in the British official history that this gallant little band of volunteers had won the highest respect of the infantry. So, quote, the landing at V Beach was probably only saved from complete disaster by the machine guns of the River Clyde. This is a photograph of 3 officers there. I think it's McLaren, Parks and Mitchell at the Krifya Bridge base camp. Talk a little bit more about that later, which is at the far end of the village, overlooking the Krifya Road, going up over to Observation Ridge, with the French area to the right, Royal Naval Division, the British to the left, and Achi Baba at the far distance. As soon as the landing was secured on V Beach, the Royal Naval Armoured Car Division came ashore in support of the infantry. No armoured cars at this stage. And there became what the British call the First Battle of Krifya, which began on the 28th of April, which is very much an advance to contact operation. This allowed the British and the French, who had now landed, to advance over a 3-mile front, but it was not without very heavy casualties. 3,000 out of the 14,000 engaged on the Allied side had become casualties by this stage. And what turned out to be an over-complex and really poorly communicated battle for the Allies led to these uncoordinated advances and loss of cohesion for the troops. Casualties to date had been colossal, and as the rates that Sir Ian Hamilton recognised could not be sustained without reinforcements. So any idea that they could capture Krifya or even Achi Baba or the Kilibar Plateau by that same day, the 25th, 26th of April, or even the 28th of April, was really a long way away. Unfortunately, the division was also to lose their first officer, the commanding officer James Boothby, who we mentioned earlier, from number 4 Squadron, was killed up at Anzac. He went ashore with a small detachment to support the Royal Marines that had landed in support of the Anzacs, the Australians and New Zealanders. The poor old Anzacs had been fighting there since the very first days of the landings. Unfortunately, Boothby was in the wrong place at the wrong time and killed up at Anzac. He is today buried in Beach Cemetery. But as we see, life at Anzac was no less dangerous than at Helles. Really nowhere at Gallipoli was safe from enemy fire. Boothby's death was going to be quickly followed by others. At Helles, during the nights of the 1st and 2nd of May, the Ottomans made several very large counterattacks in an effort to capture a lot of the lost ground and force the Allies back into the sea. These failed for the Ottomans and caused them very, very heavy casualties, but also very heavy casualties for the French and the British. Wedgwood had originally planned for one section of machine gunners to be in the trenches for a 48-hour shift, and the other two to be kept into reserve for rest. However, Douglas Illingworth was going to explain in the letter that, quote, the fighting was much too fierce to keep to this rule, and two sections were therefore kept forward. The Ottomans had also been reinforced, and with this new injection of men had counterattacked continuously over the next few nights against what was a very weak Allied line. At 10 p.m, Ottoman artillery on the 1st of May opened up a preliminary bombardment of the British and French positions, this leading to one of the largest Ottoman attacks that had yet been seen on the peninsula. En masse, around 15,000 Ottoman troops charged forward in the dark, penetrating the Allied lines in several places. Illingworth, whose section was in the line between the Krifia Road and Achi Baba Nulla, wrote that this was, quote, the most terrible time, countless rapid fire from every rifle and machine gun. No one can imagine what it was like who had not been in it. Now, Illingworth was going to survive the onslaught, and he later wrote that he was very thankful when daylight came and the Ottomans were driven off. But unfortunately, the squadron, number 3 squadron, was going to mourn one of the loss of its first officer, Arthur George Cook. You can see there on the left-hand side of the photograph. Fife describes the camp as being in a rather exposed position, being situated on the summit of an upstanding bluff, rather less than a mile behind the firing line. This grassy, tree-dotted plateau, which commanded the view of the entire fighting area right forward to Achi Baba. As you can see from those photographs on the right-hand side, you've got on the top right a modern-day version there. Looking down on that bluff, you can see a couple of roads there. The one going off to the right leads over into the French sector and sort of goes over Skew Bridge, and that winding road that goes up onto Observation Ridge then heads towards what was called the village of Krifia. And below you can see a rather sad photograph there of the grave of Arthur George Cook. And during our Helles battlefield study project, Warren, John and Mike and I went out and we actually located the exact position. Hence, you can see those then and now photographs. Unfortunately for Cook, there was a burst of 3 shells. There were several eyewitness accounts of shrapnel coming down, and one unfortunately pierced his forehead. And during the night, they used a torch. They realised he was dead and covered him over with a tarpaulin and then seek cover because the Turkish bombardment had continued for some time. They sent the message forward to Wedgwood that Cook had been killed, but unfortunately, Wedgwood was focused with the fighting, trying to keep the Turkish counterattack back. And yeah, sadly, the following morning, they buried Cook with full military honours. And you can see the group of officers and chief petty officers there burying Cook. And this is a view just slightly from the other angle, looking up onto that bluff. And let's move on. Throttle full open. So the counterattacks have ended, and the Second Battle of Krifia begins on the 6th of May 1915. And this was really another failure, despite the bravery of the British, the Anzac and French troops that were all engaged on the Helles front at that time. Frank Yeo, who was in number 4 squadron, wrote a letter and he said, "Everyone is asking for our guns. We're doing very good work. I was first attached to the New Zealanders, then they were relieved. I was then attached to the 7th Manchesters, and after that the 89th Punjabis. They wouldn't let us have the trenches as machine guns. They wouldn't let us leave the trenches as our machine guns were too valuable. Had some wonderful escapes, had one shot through my water bottle and another through my cap, but still going strong." And he says, throttle full open. He's probably very anxious to get into his armoured car at some stage. Sadly, by this stage of the Second Battle of Krifia, Number 3 Squadron had almost suffered 50% or just over 50% casualties. Cook was killed. Wedgwood and Illingworth were both wounded and evacuated from Gallipoli, along with 48 other ranks who were killed or badly wounded. This only left around 6 or 7 officers in the squadron, number 3 Squadron, and around 57 other ranks, which were still aboard transport, so they had to get ashore as quickly as possible. And they also took a decision now to land their armoured cars, and you can see there one of the transport lighters there with a Rolls-Royce armoured car with its crew on its way to come ashore. But there's no immediate opportunities really found for them on the shore. But in early June, that was all going to change. On the map there, you can see Saint-Omer down the bottom there and sort of V Beach on the bottom left. And the objective for the second and third Battle of Krithia, which is the village of Krithia, you can see at the top of the screen there. Now, the plan for the armoured cars, and some interesting research I found doing this talk, it wasn't initially 4, it was going to be the full 8 armoured cars were going to be used in this attack. They're going to leave their base camp, which is roughly, I'm pointing there, I hope you can see that on the map, circling around that number 10. You can see this bridge, which I understand is the Krithia Bridge. This was their base camp. And you're going to have 2 armoured cars, which are going to follow this track to the left, drive up what was called at the time the West Krithia track past Pink Farm, and head towards the Turkish trenches around the Boomerang Redoubt. At the same time, another 2 or 3 cars were going to go up what was called the West Krithia Road to the left of Krithia Nulla and engage on the trenches towards the Ottoman front lines there, while some more cars were going to go what we call today the Krithia Road, go up over Backhouse Post and Observation Ridge and towards what it was called the Vineyard. Crazy, those people who know that area, because it is full of scrub, it's full of trenches, it's full of rock and very, very difficult to manoeuvre. It is not the open warfare that armoured cars are best suited to. However, late May, on the 29th of May, Lieutenant Commander Reginald Colmore, who took over from Wedgwood, was now commanding both 3 and 4 squadrons, and he made a reconnaissance up onto Fir Tree Spur and looked where he could engage the cars best. It's decided not to use the cars on the tracks themselves, but either side of the tracks where the soil and the ground was a little bit firmer. The plan was to actually take the cars up to trenches, and you can see here H8A and H89, and to engage the Ottoman defenders there with Maxim guns to support the infantry who were going to go over the top at the same time. To actually do that, they had to bridge some of the trenches, and in the diary of Lieutenant Arthur Berend, First Fourth E Flanks, he's got a great little quote in there about a Royal Engineers officer turning up and saying, "We need to build a trestle bridge over your trench." He says, "What is it for?" "Oh, it's for the armoured cars." So, these were all new at the time, and it was probably quite a sight to see these armoured cars crossing these trenches. At 12 noon on the 4th of June 1915, after the barrage, the armoured cars launched themselves into battle. One great quote is from a Chief Petty Officer Johnson, who said in one of his letters, quote, "The air was very heavily laden with dust and we could see absolutely nothing but a bank of yellow fog. Presently a shout went up and hands pointed to the rise, which formed the skylines across the Nulla. Plainly we could see a string of armoured cars jolting and swaying over the rough and shell-torn ground. As they got near the firing line, the cheering increased and puffs of shrapnel played around the cars, or high explosives fell near and hid them from a cloud of dust from our view. We noticed one car topple onto its side. Its 2 wheels had skidded into a trench, and immediately it became the target of enemy guns. One car turned and made its way rearward. Another suddenly dropped into a depression, suffering a shock which caused the turret to become detached and toppled off the gun, leaving the car useless. Dust rose in huge clouds and hid the remainder out of sight." The diary from Gerald Valentine Sharkey also describes, and he talks of the attack on the 4th of June. He wrote, "What a cheer we got from our troops as we dashed along the Krithia Road, passing one line of trench after another. The boys inside the cars were shouting their old war cry, 'Belted in,' and the Tommies were shouting, 'Come on, the Navy,' etc., etc. The cars got a certain distance and then got stuck between the two firing lines, which you probably don't want to be stuck at." He then goes on to write, "The noise inside the cars caused by the bullets hitting against the armour plate was deafening, and then after a bit they started pitching high explosives at us. But luckily for us, the Turks' shooting was bad and not a car got seriously damaged. Around 12:30 in the afternoon, I sent a car to base and its as its gun was damaged and completely out of action. Lieutenant Holden's car was sent back with its turret off. Holden himself badly wounded inside. Rummings had half his head blown off, so they told us and the driver of the car, Scott, who practically went mad inside, had to retire. Thankfully, nobody was hurt inside the Fox, and we had the best of luck. Our tyres were blown to pieces, also our wheels, but we managed to return." And there you can see in that artistic drawing, which I thought was quite fabricated at the time, but I think it's quite realistic. Shows you the armour car, and just note the Fox mascots ahead. We saw the original photograph of that back in Devon. You can see the viaduct, the old Roman viaducts, and the 5 pillars off in the distance. And you can see what they're trying to do there is clear what is here is the Turkish rock parapet to allow the cars to not only get over their own front line, which they had done, get into no man's land, but also get across the Turkish front line, which unfortunately they failed to do. Another idea you can see from that top photograph, so 2 of the cars along the West Krithia Road have these grappling irons, and the whole purpose of the car there, which is not to use it as they were originally intended as a reconnaissance vehicle, but the British really deploy them tactically more like tanks, drive up over the trenches. Here they had to reverse to the Turkish front line, throw a grappling hook over it. How that was done or who would do that, I do not know, and pull the wire away to allow the infantry to advance. That was a total failure, and no car got closer to the front lines with a grappling hook, so that was a complete disaster. Another sort of artist's impression there of the car attack. Some of the armour cars under Commander Nutt had actually got as far as trench F11, so had actually got over where the Turkish front lines were, but unfortunately had to withdraw under increased Ottoman shell fire and rifle and machine gun fire. So really by around 12 noon, 20 minutes after the main attack, the armour cars were withdrawing from where they had come. 3 officers, Holden, Leicester and Commander Coleman, had all been wounded. Their cars had minor damage, so nothing necessarily serious there, which would knock them out of action. Colmore himself would actually survive Gallipoli, but sadly killed post-war in the R101 airship disaster. And poor old Petty Officer Rummin, you can see here, he survived the River Clyde landing, got awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, so the one down from the Victoria Cross of the Royal Navy. His head injuries he suffered from the 4th of June were so serious that he was invalided out. However, it didn't stop him re-enlisting in 1916 as he tried to get into the Machine Gun Corps, but he was discharged from that in July 17 on medical grounds. He had epilepsy, I believe, and no longer fit for war service, and sadly died in November 1917 from his Gallipoli wounds. Great photograph there inside of a Rolls-Royce armoured car turret. You can see the Vickers machine gun there. Just want to point out the close proximity. You've got the head, bottom left-hand corner of the driver, which is probably not a nice place to be, having that gun barking across your head, plus the shells being ejected from the machine gun, falling onto your head. But you can see how cramped it was inside those cars at the time. Not a place I would like to be. Got a great photograph there at rest. And this is probably just before or just after the 4th of June. You can see bullet splatters on the front armour of the Rolls-Royce there in front of the radiator, and you can see the Vickers machine gun still mounted there. So at that stage, this tells me that the gun had not been dismounted to support the infantry before or after that attack. You've got another photograph there, very famous photograph from the Imperial War Museum of 4, I think I'm counting there, armoured cars in their dugouts. As mentioned before, there were 8 actually landed. And another sort of view, another sort of variation of that. And you can clearly see there, their Maxim or Vickers guns have been removed, and they would be in the trenches supporting the infantry at that time. And another sort of variation of that one, and another variation of those as well. Hunter Weston, after the Third Battle of Krithia attack, wrote, "The armoured cars were not of great assistance in our attack. In future, knowing that we have armoured cars, the Turks will be on the lookout for further, and their chance of successful action will be lessened. I think they will be better if they are re-embarked." So later in June, it was decided that the vehicles should be re-embarked. Those already aboard the transports were sent to Egypt, and those including the Fox we saw in that photographs were taken off of Gallipoli late July, early August. So they still stayed there for a little while before they were withdrawn completely. And that was really the end of the days for the armoured cars themselves at Gallipoli. But the characters were still there. We've also mentioned there were 4 other squadrons, Maxim motor squadrons, number 9, 10, 11 and 12. 9, 11 and 12 went to Suvla. They were attached later on in the campaign to General Stopford's 9th Corps. Number 9 squadron was under Lieutenant Commander Arthur Borton, you can see in that photograph there, who was an amazing individual. And he landed on the 16th of August 1915 with his machine guns, no armour cars, just machine guns, and stationed in support of the 10th Division up at Jepson's Post on Kerridge Tepe Ridge. He is a right old character. He ends the war with Victoria Cross, the CMG and DSO. Born in Kent, an old Etonian, and went through Sandhurst, commissioned into the 60th Rifles, the King of Wales Rifle Corps, served throughout the South African War, 1899 to 1902, and left the army in 1910. He'd rejoined in 1914 with the Great War and became an observer with the Royal Flying Corps in France. That career, being a flyer, was cut short after he had a crash and broke his neck in 3 places and declared unfit. Yes, unfit, not dead. Despite that, he went out to Gallipoli as a lieutenant commander in charge of 9th Squadron, went on to serve in France and Palestine, got decorated with the Victoria Cross in November 1917 out in Palestine, went on to serve in the North Russian campaign, where, funny enough, armoured cars were also used, and at the end of the war was actually one of the pallbearers for the burial of the unknown warrior on the 11th of November 1920, and he died later in 1933. A brilliant photograph here, courtesy of the Imperial War Museum, and you can see some of Borton's men, almost certainly from 9th Squadron, and it does a little bit, it looks like Jepson's Post, but definitely the Kerridge Tepe Ridge, just by the nature of the ground there. And some great maps there, thanks to Michael Robson for, pointing these out. On the left, you can see the Kerridge Tepe Ridge, you can see the Turkish positions, on the North Redoubt, the Pimple and the Benchmark, and Jepson's Post, which is the furthest the British forces have got to the Turks on the ridge at Kerridge Tepe. And you've got a zoomed photograph of that post here, and you can see where they position the Royal Naval Armoured Car Division guns. Got number 1 gun, number 2 is just off the map, number 3 gun, number 4 gun, number 5 gun, etc. And their base camp, which is very interesting because it shows you where the armory was, where Turkish sniper sangers were, observation posts, etc. And you sort of got the similar view there from the same artist as well, looking across the Suvla plain. And what they've marked on here, which is quite interesting, is the yardage for his machine guns. So he's some machine gunners there have marked out exactly the range for the machine guns to fire on what they call burnt farm. You've got a trench here, you've got different trenches and positions around there. So the infantry can call in supportive fire onto those positions, and the Royal Naval Armoured Car guys can give that valuable support to the infantry. But before we sort of end talking about the British, I want to say, a big thank you to Tom Iredale of the Gallipoli Association, and also Eric Lamboret, who's on the call from the French National Association for the Remembrance of the Dardanelles and Eastern Fronts, to make me aware of these wonderful photographs from the Demard collection, which shows French armour cars, which up until recently I didn't know were landed. I've always looked at it from a British perspective. Now, we believe the French landed possibly up to 6 Archer model armour cars at Saddle-Boyer, and you can see on that photograph on the left-hand side the Saddle-Boyer Castle, and on the right-hand side, especially the bottom right, and there it is, the River Clyde you can see in the background. So all of these were taken on Gallipoli. Now, they played a minor role from what I could find out during the Second Battle of Krifia. The French plan was to use them to support the infantry in an advance, which sadly there wasn't, and also to help repel any Turkish counterattack. So I would say probably more a traditional use for an armoured car. The car itself was designed by Joseph Archer, and it was based on a model 1914 Hupmobile, which was actually an American civil car at the time. In the second photograph, we can see the loading or the offloading on the French line of the La Provence in February 1915. And if we just point out here, what you're seeing here is just a normal touring car, but just behind the car here, that one and that one, are 2 Archer cars. And on the bottom right, you can see the Archer armoured car there as well. So fascinating photographs. In March 1915, it was also very interesting to find out that the transport that took the armour cars with 1 officer and some of their crew to Alexandria in Egypt were embarked on none other than the British steamer, the SS River Clyde. So the River Clyde in March took those armour cars out to Egypt for the first part of their journey before they were landed on Gallipoli. So it's amazing how these things all link and they all come together. We have a model here, another French car, the Charon, which was a 1902 model. And I've included this because several, I think there's 5 actually, was actually sold to the Sultan, I think around 1908, 1909, just before the Sultan was overthrown. And there's quite a few photographs in the Ottoman archives of these armoured cars on the streets of Constantinople or Istanbul. And you can see the car there. Probably not the best car if you're the driver or the commander, because it's totally unarmoured in the front. But what you have is this sort of bathtub design on the very back of it with a Hotchkiss machine gun. And those are in use throughout, obviously pre-war and throughout the First World War, but as far as I can find out, not on the Gallipoli battlefield itself. If you want to know anything more about armoured cars, there's some very useful reading there, and I'll leave that slide up for a few minutes. British armoured cars in particular went on to serve under Lochelampton in Russia, and they served with both the Canadians and the British on the Western Front, particularly in 1918. Both the British and the Australians used light car patrols, almost the forerunner of the long-range desert group from the Second World War. And they used those light car patrols in Libya, Egypt and Palestine, where, of course, Lawrence of Arabia asked for and received a force of 9 battle-ready Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost model cars. I actually wonder how many of those cars that ended up with Lawrence were originally in Gallipoli, and I have a suspected feeling that probably all of the 8 landed were actually used in Egypt and used with Lawrence. The Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost armoured car continued in use long after the First World War, And it wasn't actually it wasn't actually discontinued rather until 1944, where it served very loyally with the RAF in the desert in North Africa. But of course, those are stories all for another day. And the last photograph there is another Silver Ghost. This is probably taken in Devon just before they embarked out to Gallipoli. And you can see that same armoured car there, the rather macabre mounted mascot there of a fox's head. So it's for me to say thank you, and it's also for Foxy to say thank you as well. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.